Welcome back to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton here at the top of hour two. And during the last hour, we spoke a bit about China's global strategy and this Trump administration's pushback, which I think is potentially a revolutionary change in American foreign policy. Today, we're joined by an expert on the subject, Dean Cheng, who's a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, where he specializes in Chinese political and security affairs. Dean, thank you so much for joining us, and Happy New Year.
Thank you for having me, and Happy New Year to you as well.
Appreciate it. Dean, when we look at China's malign activities and also China's stated national goals, the question is, how does it implicate U.S. national interests? And the question I would ask is, to you, what would the world look like if China achieved its stated national goals by, say, 2049?
Well, so what we have with China, I think it's important to emphasize, is not a rising power. This is not Imperial Germany circa 1913. In some ways, it's more dangerous because it's a returning power. For thousands of years, China dominated all of Asia. It was the Middle Kingdom. It was also the Central Kingdom. All of its neighbors, they never balanced against China. Instead, they were tributary states. They offered tribute to China. And I think that's the model of international relations that China is now bringing to a global stage. China wants to be China is a returning major power, and as the number two economy in the world, soon potentially to be the number one, that's how it wants to be treated. The implications for the United States are quite severe. If the so-called Made in China 2025 project succeeds, for example, then China wants to be the world's leader in the manufacturing of things ranging from locomotive engines to aircraft to agricultural products to microchips. And the question people should be asking is, what do you think the world would look like then in 2026 if China succeeds? I think the answer to that is China would have a protected domestic market that other countries would not be able to compete in, but which would generate the money for China to then subsidize a global push on the economic side to dominate global locomotive trade, global aircraft trade, global space operations, global microchip manufacturing. And as we've seen with Sri Lanka, as we've seen elsewhere in Asia, when China dominates, other countries bow.
What do you make of my assessment that the currently ongoing trade negotiations are merely one part of a much more comprehensive effort to push back on China using some or even all elements of U.S. national power, as we've seen embedded in documents like the Trump administration's national security strategy, the national defense strategy, and numerous addresses, including those by Vice President Pence in recent months?
Well, I hope you're correct. The problem I have with that assessment is I think it's overly optimistic. We seem to have a government that has distinct trouble coordinating among its various elements. We certainly have a government where various parts of the deep state seem to feel that they are entitled to try and act against presidential directives and operations. So I'm hoping that there is more of a strategy there being in the implementation. But I do think you've identified two key documents that did, in fact, come out and mark a huge sea change. The National Security Strategy and the National Defense Strategy basically say we view China and Russia as our foremost threats, not terrorism, not ISIS, not Al-Qaeda. Those are still bad, but the people that we have to truly worry about are nation-state level actors who can mobilize a huge amount of resources. And in the case of China, they are mobilizing not just military resources, but economic, political, human, technological, and financial.
What is the significance? Often we hear about China's man-made islands, militarization of those islands, efforts in the South China Sea, and essentially trying to exert their sovereignty over waters that the international community would generally argue, and certainly the U.S. would argue, are not theirs. What is the impact of those moves on everyday American life ultimately?
Ultimately speaking, we are talking about China trying to expand its sovereignty over international common spaces. So, For the South China Sea issue, we're talking about the carotid artery of global trade. $5.3 trillion of goods moves through those waters every year. If your listeners are listening on a laptop, if they are going to later watch the Rose Bowl tomorrow on a flat screen, if they're going to get a beer or a soft drink out of a refrigerator, those goods quite likely have passed through the South China Sea, and if not the goods themselves, certainly subparts and components. If China controls those waters as national waters, then it has the ability to really basically strangle international trade, or at least make it much more expensive for all of those goods.
There was recently a bipartisan report published which essentially said, and I will paraphrase it here, that the U.S. might not win in a war head-to-head with China, presumably a conventional war. What do you make of that report, and how would you compare overall China's conventional and non-conventional capabilities versus those of America?
Well, the Chinese have two advantages. One is very basic, which people forget, which is the U.S. is a global military power. And we need to be because we have global interests. What that means is every dollar we spend on defense gets spread around the world. China is still a regional military power, and every renminbi, every yuan it spends, it mostly gets this focus at home. So if we have 12 aircraft carriers, in the Pacific, if we're lucky, we have 7, and not all of those are going to be available. China is working on its 3rd aircraft carrier, and they're keeping all of those at home. So far from 12 to 3, we're looking at 7 to 3, and probably less. So that's the basic. The bigger issue is China knows where it wants to go. China sees us as a threat. For 8 years, we had an administration that actively worked to prevent us from even saying that China is a threat. We had a senior commander of Pacific Command who said the greatest threat in his area of responsibility, meaning the entire Pacific, was climate change. Not North Korea, not China, climate change. When you have senior military commanders thinking that way, talking that way, you're going to have a lot harder time trying to get the resources and the war planning done versus an adversary who says, you know who my biggest enemy is? It's the United States.
Yeah, one can only imagine what the perception of those comments about climate change was in Beijing. And meanwhile, it's not as if there have not been a series of potentially cataclysmic acts that China has engaged in towards the U.S. that oftentimes I think are overlooked. 2 of them in recent years being the OPM hack, number 1, and number 2, the literal liquidation, killing of our intelligence network on Chinese soil. Put in context how devastating those 2 acts have been.
China, somebody once pointed out, a major British historian pointed out, we should be rewriting the entire history of the Second World War now that all of the secrets have been declassified about how we were reading all of the German codes and all the Japanese codes. That is how fundamental our ability to read their information was. The fact that the Chinese basically have all of our personnel data and were able to crack our communications to kill off our network of agents gives you an idea of how much of our mail, email, documents, data flow they are reading. This is, if there is a conflict and the other side knows your orders, knows where your forces are going, knows your rules of engagement, you are seriously up a creek.
What is China's end goal in establishing control of ports throughout the world, including most notably in Europe and the Middle East? This has been described by some as sort of a Trojan horse effort. To what end?
Well, I don't think it is so that there will be Chinese troops walking the Unter den Linden or occupation forces in Rome. This is not how the Chinese, I think, are thinking. I think what it is to have enough of control and influence over key parts of the global trade and later the global financial system, that when another country, be it the United States or Germany or whomever, says, hey, you have to stop hacking into our data. Hey, you have to start respecting intellectual property rights. The Chinese say, it'd be a real shame if none of your cranes worked, if none of your pipelines worked. I mean, that's the sort of thing that we are seeing now in Sri Lanka, apparently now in Kenya, is where the Chinese have financed ports and things, and then they basically say, hey, you signed this contract, pay up. And when the country can't, it's like, okay, well, that's simple enough. We're foreclosing and we're taking over the port. When you're talking about a country like Greece or Hungary, that is potentially the situation. Less likely in a place like Germany or France because they are wealthier. But poor European countries may someday face the same piper.
What is the appropriate response to what I've frequently referred to as sort of a loan-to-own strategy? That is, China provides financing that seems to present no strings attached to it, but then ultimately the financing, the debt burden becomes crippling, and then the foreign nation has to then turn over those assets to the Chinese. What is the appropriate response from the West in general and America in particular?
Well, I think one important thing not to do is to not get into a competition with the Chinese on who can loan more people more money. Because as my good friend Derek Scissors over at the American Enterprise Institute has pointed out, you will never out-subsidize the Chinese. Their loans and things are not based on financial balance sheets. It's not based on a good business plan. It is strategic. It is, hey, I want influence in this country. I don't care if that port never makes money. If I gain influence, that's my payoff. So on the one hand, so long as we are operating on a more financially sound basis, that's part of what we should be doing. We should be saying, hey, this port is a good idea. We should look at it because it will make everybody money, including the owning country. In the meantime, though, one of the things we could probably do is, for example, create a voluntary corps of legal experts so that poorer countries could have advice to say, look, you may not realize this, but these loan terms are terrible. You may not realize this, but they are going to ultimately charge you an arm and a leg and a head in terms of interest rates. Don't sign this contract. We might even offer to help provide negotiators, and because they would be paid, therefore, they are presumably going to be working for the government of the other country, to say, look, you may need some actual negotiating advice, legal advice on, before you sign with the Chinese. These are things that I think, human talent-wise, we could be helping to develop in these countries so that they have a better chance of standing up to the Chinese.
You speak about the sort of illogic from an economic perspective of much of China's efforts abroad to essentially buy influence, not actually have prosperous projects. Domestically, I wonder if you could speak a bit to the idea that, look, central planning fails everywhere that it's tried. To what degree has central planning hampered the Chinese, and ultimately could it prove to be, to some degree, their downfall, their fatal flaw?
I think that if I were a more suspicious person, I'd say that Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez basically seems to be a better disciple of Mao than the Chinese. The Chinese themselves have said, look, central planning doesn't work. So the Chinese economy today is this weird hybrid. They call it a socialist market economy, where certain directives are laid out and state-owned enterprises don't operate according to making a profit. But resource allocation still does, in fact, use the market to sort of get signals through, hey, this is working, this isn't working. So on the one hand, your average Chinese person, the restaurants they eat at, many of the shops they shop at, those are real private commercial enterprises. But steel, shipbuilding, aerospace, those are state champions. They are given centralized direction. And we're watching a slowdown in innovation in those areas precisely because they are operating under an ever heavier dead hand of, sort of higher level oversight and direction rather than the hidden hand of more traditional capitalism.